The report had my name on it, but I never wrote it. I didn't know that yet. That realization would come later. But looking back now, that night was already different before I ever saw it. The shift started the same way every other night shift did. Routine, predictable, almost mechanical. You check in, follow protocol, walk the same routes, and wait for morning. After a while, it stops feeling like work. It starts feeling like repetition, something your body does without needing your full attention. That night should have been no different, but the moment I stepped outside, something felt off. The air was still, not just quiet, heavy. The kind of silence that doesn't fade into the background, but sits there, pressing against you. Usually, there's always something. Wind moving across the perimeter. Distant equipment humming. Small, random sounds that remind you the place is alive. That night, all of that had been stripped away. Even the generators sounded lower. I stood there for a second longer than usual, just listening, trying to find something familiar in the silence. But there was nothing to hold on to. It wasn't empty. It felt occupied, in a way I couldn't explain. I shook it off. You don't overthink things out there. You follow routine, trust your training, keep moving. So I signed in, checked my assignment, and took my position like I always did. Same route, same checkpoints, same system. Everything looked normal on paper. But it didn't feel normal anymore. The first part of the route went by without anything unusual. I moved through each checkpoint, scanning the same areas I had seen countless times before. Every step felt familiar. But there was a subtle disconnect. Like something wasn't lining up the way it should. Not wrong enough to stop, just wrong enough to notice. About halfway through, I stopped near the outer fence. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, nothing out of place. But I had the distinct feeling that I had already been standing there earlier in the night. Same position, same angle, same moment. That shouldn't have been possible. I checked my watch immediately, trying to place where I was in the timeline of the shift. Everything looked normal. No missing time, no skipped intervals. Just a strange sense that I was repeating something I hadn't done yet. It didn't make sense. I stayed there longer than I should have, trying to shake the feeling. But the longer I stood still, the worse it got. Not fear. Not exactly, just a growing awareness that something about the sequence of the night wasn't right. So I moved on. That's what you're trained to do. Don't hesitate. Don't dwell. Just continue the route. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it followed me. Every checkpoint started to feel slightly familiar in the wrong way. Like I was remembering things before they happened. At one point, I crossed paths with another soldier on rotation. I almost said something, just a quick comment, something small. Enough to check if I was the only one feeling it, but I stopped myself. You don't start conversations like that during a shift. It creates distraction, and distraction is the one thing you avoid at all costs. So I just nodded and kept walking. The rest of the shift passed without any visible incidents, no alarms, no calls, nothing that justified the feeling building in the back of my mind. By the time the rotation ended, I had already started convincing myself it was nothing. Fatigue, repetition, your brain filling in gaps where there aren't any. That explanation should have been enough. But as I signed out and headed back inside, one thought stayed with me. It didn't feel like I had just finished the shift. It felt like I had already lived it. before it even started. The report was already there before I sat down. I didn't notice it immediately. Everything felt routine. Same room, same system, same process after every shift. You log in, go through the entries, finalize what needs to be submitted. Automatic, something you do without thinking. But then I saw my name. The report had already been filed. At first, I assumed it was something I had submitted at the end of my shift and just didn't remember clearly. That happens sometimes. Long hours, repetitive work. You don't always recall every detail. So, I opened it without much concern, expecting something familiar. It wasn't. The moment I started reading, something felt wrong, not obvious, not immediate, but enough to slow me down. The report described an incident near the outer perimeter, movement along the fence line, environmental conditions, positioning. Everything was written cleanly, professionally, exactly how it should be, and exactly how I would have written it. That was the first problem. The structure, the phrasing, even the way the sentences were broken down. It matched my style perfectly. Not just similar, identical. The kind of small habits you don't notice, unless you're looking for them. But I didn't remember writing any of it. I read it again, slower this time, waiting for something to click, a detail, a moment, anything that would connect it back to my shift. The location was correct, the timing lined up. It even described a section of my route where things had started to feel slightly off. But the event itself, nothing. No memory, no recognition, just a blank space where something should have been. I leaned back, trying to reconstruct the night step by step. From signing in to completing the route, everything played back the way it should have. No gaps, no interruptions. It had felt quiet, uneventful, almost too normal. And yet, this report existed, logged under my name, time-stamped precisely. Already processed into the system like it had always been there. I checked the timestamp again, then again. It didn't change. It placed the report exactly where it should have been if I had written it. Not earlier, not later, right in the middle of my shift. That didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. Because if the timing was correct, then there should have been a moment where I sat down, accessed the system, and wrote it. And there wasn't. I would have remembered that. Reports like this aren't written on autopilot. They require attention, detail, awareness. This wasn't something you forget. And yet, I had no memory of it happening. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to say something, to confirm that they had seen me file it, or at least noticed something unusual. But everything around me carried on like normal. Conversation stayed low. Screens flickered with the same routine data. No one paid any attention. I went back to the report again, focusing on the smaller details, the wording, the flow, the way certain observations were framed. It didn't just sound like something I would write. It felt like something I had already written before. That was the part I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just familiarity. It was recognition without memory, like reading something I knew belonged to me, but couldn't place in time. I closed the file, sat there for a moment, staring at the screen without really seeing it. The logical explanation kept trying to settle in. Fatigue, oversight, something simple I was overcomplicating. But that explanation didn't hold, because no matter how many times I went through it, there was still no moment where I remembered writing it. I didn't say anything at first, not because I wasn't concerned, but because I didn't know how to explain it without it sounding wrong. There's a difference between something you don't understand and something that doesn't make sense at all. This felt like the second one. So I kept it to myself, finished what I needed to do, tried to move on. That lasted a few hours. I was back in the admin room, going through another set of routine logs when I heard it. Not loud, not meant for everyone. Just a quiet conversation between two soldiers a few desks over. I wasn't paying attention at first, just background noise. Then one sentence cut through it. I don't remember writing it. I didn't turn immediately. I just listened. Then one of them was explaining that a report had been filed under his name from the previous night. Same situation, same tone, same confusion. He kept saying it didn't make sense, that he had no memory of submitting anything like that. The other one thought he was joking at first, but the longer he talked, the quieter the conversation became. That was when I stood up. I walked over, trying to keep it casual. But there's no easy way to enter that kind of conversation. I asked what they meant. For a second, neither of them answered. Just a brief pause, like they were deciding whether or not to say anything at all. Then I told them I had seen the same thing that changed everything. The hesitation disappeared almost immediately. Whatever line they had been holding before, it was gone. We started comparing details right there, quietly, making sure no one else was paying attention. The similarities were too exact to ignore. Each report was written in the exact style of the person it was assigned to. Not just structure, but tone, word choice, the small habits you don't consciously think about. It wasn't imitation. It was accurate in a way that didn't leave room for variation. And none of us remembered writing them. Not vaguely, not partially, completely absent. We pulled up the reports side by side. Different incidents, different locations, but the same pattern. Clean, precise, and disconnected from memory. The more we compared, the worse it got. One of them pointed at the timestamp. Look at this, they all lined up. Every report was filed during normal activity windows. No gaps, no unusual delays. Times where we should have been fully aware of what we were doing. That didn't help. It made it harder to explain. If something had happened, there should have been a sign, a delay, a break, something that didn't match the routine. But everything looked normal, too normal. The conversation stayed controlled. No raised voices, no panic. That's just how things are handled. You don't jump to conclusions. You don't let uncertainty turn into distraction. But even without saying it directly, something had shifted. This wasn't isolated anymore. It wasn't just my report. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns don't happen without a reason. Before we broke off, one of them mentioned something that didn't sit right. His report described movement near a section he hadn't even reached during his shift. Not something he forgot. Something that didn't happen at all. That changed the weight of everything. Because now it wasn't just about missing memory. It was about records being created for events that didn't exist. We went back to our stations after that, but nothing felt routine anymore. Every system we used felt less reliable. Every action felt like it needed to be checked twice. And when I looked at my own report again, it didn't feel like a mistake anymore. It felt like the beginning of something that had already started. By the next shift, the reports didn't feel like mistakes anymore. They felt deliberate. No one said it directly, but you could see it in how everyone moved. Slower, more aware. Like we were all paying attention to something we hadn't fully acknowledged yet. The reports were still appearing, still structured the same way. But now we were looking at them differently. It's not as something we forgot, but as something we needed to understand. I pulled mine up again before heading out. This time, I didn't skim it. I read it carefully, line by line, like I was looking for something hidden inside it. That's when the details started to stand out. The report didn't just describe movement near the fence, it tracked it. Precise pacing, direction changes, even pauses between movements. Not just what happened, but how it happened. The kind of detail you don't write unless you're actively observing something for an extended period of time. I never did that, not like this. I kept reading. There were references to angles I couldn't have seen from where I was positioned. Mentions of blind spots that required a completely different vantage point. It didn't read like a ground-level observation anymore. It read like something that could see everything at once. That didn't match reality. Out there, your perspective is limited. You rely on routes, checkpoints, overlapping coverage. You never get a complete view alone. That's why everything is documented separately. But this report didn't feel separate. It felt complete. I brought it up with the others before we started the shift. This time, the conversation wasn't about whether the reports existed. That part was already understood. Now we were comparing what was inside them. And that's when it got worse. One of the soldiers had a report that described a conversation he had during his shift. Not just that it happened, but the exact wording, every line, every pause, even the tone. He confirmed most of it, but there were parts he didn't remember saying out loud. Just thinking. Another report included positioning data from 2 separate patrol routes at the same time. That wasn't possible. There was no overlap between those routes. No way for a single person to observe both without physically being in 2 places at once. We stopped talking for a moment after that. Not because we ran out of explanations, because none of them worked anymore. We checked the system logs again. Everything looked normal. No unauthorized access. No external interference. Every report pointed back to us. Our IDs, our credentials, our writing patterns. But the content didn't match what we knew. That disconnect started to settle in, not as confusion anymore, but as something heavier, more focused. The reports weren't just recording events. They were seeing more than we could. Later that night, during my route, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. Every sound, every shift in the environment, every small detail that could turn into another entry. Not because I expected something to happen, but because I wanted to catch the moment it did. Nothing happened. The route was quiet, still, exactly the way it always had been. And somehow, that made it worse. Because if nothing was happening, then where was all that detail coming from? By then, the reports weren't just something we noticed. They were something we started studying. Quietly, without drawing attention, but with enough focus that it became part of the routine. We started with the writing itself. That seemed like the most obvious place to look. Each report followed the same structure we were trained to use. Clean formatting, clear sequencing, no unnecessary detail. Or that part wasn't unusual. What stood out was how personal each one felt. Not emotional, not expressive, just specific. I recognized my own writing immediately. The way I described distances, the way I kept sentences short and controlled. Even the way I avoided adding anything that wasn't directly relevant. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. That was the first thing that didn't sit right, because if I tried to rewrite that same report from memory, I couldn't. We tested it. Each of us took one of the reports and tried to recreate it without looking. Same structure, same details, same tone. None of us could match it perfectly. We got close, but something was always off. A sentence too long, a detail placed differently, a tone that didn't quite align. The originals were too precise, too accurate. It didn't feel like writing anymore. It felt like replication. One of the others pointed something out that shifted everything. He said the reports didn't just match how we write. They matched how we think while writing. That difference mattered. Because there's always a gap between thought and documentation. You filter things, you remove uncertainty, you leave out anything that isn't confirmed. That's how official reports work. But these didn't follow that rule. They included things we would never normally write down. I went back to my own report and read it again, slower this time. There was a line in the middle I hadn't paid attention to before. It described a pause in movement, followed by a change in direction. But it didn't just describe it, it interpreted it. That's not something we do without confirmation. You don't assign meaning to something unless you're sure. But this line did, and it did it in a way that felt familiar, not in how I write reports, but in how I think through situations. That was the difference. It wasn't copying my report style. It was copying my internal process. I asked the others if they saw anything similar. They had. One of them pointed out that his report included a conclusion he had considered, but never written. Another said his report used phrasing that matched thoughts he never spoke out loud. That's when everything shifted. These reports weren't just written like us. They were thinking like us. And if something could think like us, then it didn't need to copy anything anymore. The first time it happened, I almost ignored it. It didn't feel dramatic, no sudden blackout, no disorientation, nothing that would immediately trigger concern, just a small break in awareness. The kind you could explain away if you didn't think about it too much. But the problem wasn't how it felt, it was how much was missing. I was moving along my route, heading from one checkpoint to the next. Same path, same sequence, something I could walk without thinking. I remember checking my watch as I passed one of the markers. The time was exactly where it should have been. Then I was somewhere else, already at the next checkpoint. No transition, no memory of walking there, just the sudden realization that I had arrived. For a second, I didn't even recognize where I was standing. That part passed quickly. Training kicks in. You reorient. You continue. But the feeling stayed just long enough to leave something behind. Something that didn't fit. I checked my watch again. The time didn't match. Too much had passed. Not a few seconds, not even a minute. Enough time that I should have remembered something. The path between those 2 points wasn't short. There were turns, landmarks, small variations in terrain. You don't just skip all of that. But I had. I stood there trying to reconstruct it, step by step, like we're trained to do when something doesn't line up. But there was nothing to reconstruct. It was like that entire stretch of time had been removed completely, not forgotten. Gone. I finished the route, but everything after that felt slightly disconnected, like I was paying attention to something just beneath the surface, instead of what was directly in front of me. Every movement felt deliberate, like I was trying to stay present in a way I normally didn't have to. When I got back inside, I didn't go through the usual process. I went straight to the system. There was a new report, already filed, under my name. I opened it slowly, even though I already knew what I was going to find. It described activity along my route, not general movement, specific observation, timing, positioning, environmental conditions. It read like a continuous record of everything that should have happened while I was moving between those checkpoints. Everything I couldn't remember. That was the connection. The missing time wasn't random. It matched the report exactly. Every gap, every moment I couldn't account for. Filled with detail I never recorded. And somehow, it was accurate. I brought it up with the others that same day. No hesitation this time. No holding back details. And before I even finished explaining, they were already nodding. They had experienced it too. Different routes, different shifts, but the same pattern. Moments slipping out of memory, followed by reports that filled those gaps perfectly. Some of them had tried tracking it, checking times, marking positions. It didn't matter. The gaps still happened, and the reports still appeared. That was when everything shifted again. Because if those reports were being written during the time we couldn't remember, then something was happening while we weren't there. At first, it felt like something you could ignore, a passing thought, a small instinct, the kind of thing you notice for a second and then push aside because there's no reason for it to be there. That's what I told myself. It didn't hold. The first time it became clear. I was halfway through my route, moving along the outer section where visibility drops and everything feels more closed in. Same terrain, same spacing, same silence that had been there every night. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It felt occupied. I stopped without meaning to. Not because I saw something, but because something in the back of my mind told me to pay attention. I scanned the area slowly, checking the usual points first: fence line, ground level, the edges where shadows tend to gather. Everything looked normal. And that was the problem. There was nothing there. But it didn't feel like nothing. I stayed there longer than I should have, trying to figure out what exactly was triggering it. Training tells you to trust your awareness, but it also tells you not to react without cause. And this didn't give me anything to work with. No movement, no sound, no visual confirmation, just presence. It didn't feel like something nearby. It felt like something already there. That thought hit harder than it should have. Not because it made sense, but because it didn't. There was no framework for it, no explanation that fit into anything we were trained to expect. I moved on, forcing myself back into the routine, but the feeling didn't stay behind. It followed, not constant, not overwhelming, just there, like something staying just outside of focus, close enough to notice, but never close enough to identify. Later in the shift, I crossed paths with another soldier. I saw it before he said anything. The hesitation. A quick glance over his shoulder that didn't match the situation. The same kind of pause I had experienced earlier. He didn't mention it directly, but when I asked if everything was normal, his answer came just a little too late. Yeah, just quiet. That word again. Quiet. But it didn't mean what it used to mean anymore. Over the next few rotations, the same pattern showed up in different ways. Longer pauses during patrol, more frequent checks of areas that didn't require it, small breaks in routine that didn't have a clear reason behind them. No one said it out loud, but everyone adjusted the same way, like we were all reacting to something we couldn't confirm. The reports didn't help. If anything, they made it worse. Some of them started including references to observation, not direct statements, but subtle phrasing that suggested awareness beyond the person writing it. Lines that described positioning in a way that didn't match a single perspective. It felt like the reports weren't just documenting what we saw, they were documenting what was seeing us. That idea stayed with me longer than it should have. It didn't feel like paranoia, it felt accurate, and every time I stepped out onto that route, the same feeling returned, consistent, controlled, watching. By the end of the week, it wasn't something you could ignore anymore. It wasn't a thought, it wasn't a feeling. It was part of the environment. Nothing had changed on paper, but everything had changed in how it felt to be there. And once you noticed it, you couldn't shake the idea that whatever was writing those reports was still out there, watching every step before you took it. The first time someone said it out loud, no one reacted. Not because they didn't hear it, because everyone had already thought it. The reports weren't just recording what had happened, they were ahead of it. It started small. One of the soldiers mentioned a line in his report that didn't match anything from his shift. It described a short interaction near an inner checkpoint, nothing major, just a brief exchange between two patrol units passing each other. The problem was simple. He hadn't reached that checkpoint yet. At first, we treated it like a timing issue. Maybe the report had been logged late. Maybe he misremembered the sequence of his route. That explanation held for a few minutes, until we checked the timestamp. It had been filed before the interaction could have happened. We went through the system logs again. Everything was clean, no discrepancies, no delays, no signs of interference, which meant the report wasn't late, it was early. That shouldn't have been possible. It shouldn't have been able to happen. Later that same shift, the interaction happened, exactly the way it was written, same location, same wording, even the same pause before one of the responses. It didn't feel natural. It felt followed. That was when everything shifted. Before, the reports felt like records of something we couldn't remember. Now they felt like something we hadn't reached yet, something waiting ahead of us. I didn't fully accept it until it happened to me. I checked my report before starting the route. That had become routine at that point. There was already a new entry waiting. I read it carefully. It described a small moment along my path, a sound near the fence line, a pause, a shift in direction. Nothing dramatic, just a detail buried in the middle of the report. The timestamp placed it about 20 minutes ahead of where I was. I didn't react. I just continued the route. There was still a part of me that expected it not to happen, that wanted it to be wrong. But when I reached that section, it happened exactly the way it was written. The sound came first, faint, just enough to pull my attention. I stopped without thinking, waited the same way it described. Then that feeling returned, that shift. Not something I saw, something I followed. I adjusted my position the same way the report had outlined. Not consciously, not as a decision. It just happened. And that was the moment it clicked. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was following. When I got back, I didn't need to check the report again. I already knew what it would say. That was when the idea stopped being theoretical. The reports weren't just documenting us. They were ahead of us. And if they could predict something that small, something that precise, then the real question wasn't whether it would happen again. The real question was how much of what we were doing had already been written before we even thought about it. Once it became clear the reports were ahead of us, everything shifted. We stopped trying to understand them. We started trying to stop them. That was the first real mistake. The logic felt simple. If the reports were being written under our names, then somehow we were connected to them. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way we could remember, but still connected. So the plan became removing that connection entirely. We started with access. Systems locked down tighter than before. Login sessions monitored. Terminals restricted. Every entry point tracked. If a report appeared, it had to come from somewhere. It didn't change anything. Reports still showed up. Same structure, same precision. Logged under valid credentials without any sign of access. No logins, no activity, just there. So we moved to the next step. We removed isolation, paired rotations, constant check-ins. No one left alone long enough for anything to happen unnoticed. If the reports were being written during those missing moments, then removing those moments should have stopped it. It didn't. The gaps still happened. Small, almost invisible. Not long enough to notice in real time, but long enough for another report to appear. That's when frustration started to show. Not openly, not in a way that broke protocol, but you could hear it in how people spoke. See it in how long they paused before answering simple questions. Because every solution felt like something that had already failed. One of the soldiers tried something different. He stayed at the system, logged in, hands on the keyboard, waiting. If the report was going to appear, it would have to happen while he was there. He waited. Nothing happened. An hour passed, then another. Still nothing. The moment he stepped away, just for a few seconds, the report was there, already filed. No sound, no indication, no process, just complete. That was when it stopped feeling like something we could interrupt. We went back through everything again. Logs, cameras, access records, movement patterns, every possible angle. Nothing. No external interference. No system breach. No anomaly that pointed to anything outside of us. Everything led back to the same place. Us. But the connection didn't make sense anymore. We weren't doing it. Not in any way we could see, track, or remember. And if we couldn't see it, we couldn't stop it. That realization settled in quietly. Not panic, not fear. Something heavier. Because control wasn't slipping away. It had already been gone. And the worst part was starting to become clear. We weren't trying to stop something that was happening. We were trying to stop something that had already been decided. At first, the reports all sounded the same, controlled, professional, familiar. Even when they didn't match our memory, they still felt like ours. The tone stayed consistent with how we were trained to write. Neutral, structured, focused only on what could be observed. That familiarity made them easier to accept, even when nothing else about them made sense. But that didn't last. The change wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly. The structure stayed the same. The formatting didn't break. But the language underneath it started to shift in a way that was hard to notice at first, until you looked closely. The wording became sharper, not clearer, not more detailed, just more precise in a way that didn't feel human anymore. Where we would normally describe something in practical terms, the reports began framing things differently. Less like someone writing what they saw, more like something studying what it observed. That difference was subtle, but once you noticed it, you couldn't ignore it. I saw it in one of my own reports. A section that should have been a simple observation had been written like an analysis, not just noting movement, but identifying patterns within it, not just recording behavior, but defining consistency in a way that suggested it had been tracked before. That wasn't how we wrote. That wasn't how I wrote. And yet, the structure still matched me. That was what made it worse. Parts of it still sounded like me. The pacing, the sentence flow, the way information was broken down. But the tone underneath it didn't belong to me anymore. It felt detached, like the writing wasn't coming from someone inside the situation, but from something outside of it. I brought it up with the others. They had noticed it too. Each of their reports showed the same shift, not identical, but moving in the same direction, less human, more observational. Say one of them said something that stuck with me. It's not trying to sound like us anymore. That changed how we looked at everything. Before, the reports felt like something copying us, mimicking our behavior, our writing, our thought process. But now it felt like something had moved past that stage, like it had learned enough and didn't need to pretend anymore. The content reflected that shift. There were lines that carried a level of certainty we wouldn't normally use. Statements that didn't leave room for doubt. Observations that felt complete, like they didn't rely on perspective at all. It wasn't just documenting events anymore, it was defining them. That difference created a new kind of tension. Because if the reports were changing, then whatever was writing them was changing too. Adapting, learning. And if it was learning, then we weren't the ones in control of what happened next. The shift in tone was unsettling, but it still felt distant, external, something watching us, studying us. That illusion didn't last. It broke the moment the report stopped separating what we did from what we thought. The first time I noticed it, I almost missed it. It was just a single line buried in the middle of a report, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But once I read it again, it didn't belong there. Not because of how it was written, because of what it knew. It described a hesitation, a moment during my route where I had considered stopping and turning back. I remembered that moment clearly. It wasn't something I acted on, just a passing thought, something that never left my head. I never said it out loud. I never wrote it down. And yet, there it was, documented, not as speculation, not as observation, as fact. I stared at that line longer than I should have, waiting for some explanation to surface. Maybe I had said something without realizing. Maybe someone else had noticed something in my behavior. But none of that fit. It wasn't written like someone observing me. It was written like something inside the moment itself. That was the difference. I didn't say anything right away. Not until the next rotation. And even then, I didn't explain it directly. I asked a simple question instead. Have you seen anything in the reports that shouldn't be there? They understood immediately. One of them pulled up his report without saying a word and pointed to a section near the end. It described a moment where he had considered calling another unit and decided not to. He never made that call. He never mentioned the thought. But the report had it. Exactly. Another soldier had the same thing. A line describing doubt about a rote decision. Not something he showed, not something he acted on, something he only thought about. We started going through more of them after that. The pattern was clear. The reports weren't limited to what we did anymore. They included what we almost did, what we considered, what we decided against, things that never became action. That was the moment the distance disappeared. Before, it felt like something was watching us from the outside. Now, it felt like something was already there. Before anything happened, inside the process, inside the thought. I went back to my own report again, reading it from the beginning. And once I started looking for it, I found more, small lines, subtle phrasing, moments where hesitation, doubt, or decision had been captured, without ever becoming visible. They had always been there. I just hadn't recognized them. That realization hit harder than anything before it, because if the reports could include thoughts we never expressed, then whatever was creating them didn't need to observe us anymore. It already knew what we were going to think, before we did. Up until that point, everything had been controlled. Confusion, contained, fear, managed, routine, intact. No one broke protocol, no one overreacted. Even when things stopped making sense, we stayed within the system. That control was the only thing keeping everything from falling apart. It didn't last. The first break didn't come from panic. It came from certainty. It was one of the same soldiers who had been studying the reports the most. The one who first pointed out how they reflected internal thought patterns. Over the last few shifts, he had gone quieter, more focused, spending longer periods reviewing logs, comparing entries. At the time, it looked like discipline. Looking back, it wasn't. The shift started like any other. Same assignments, same rotes, same forced sense of normality we were all holding on to. But something about him felt different. Not unstable, not erratic, deliberate, like he had already decided something before the shift even began. I noticed it when we crossed paths early on. He didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge anything beyond the minimum. No glance, no hesitation, and no adjustment like the rest of us had developed. It was the first time someone looked completely unaffected. That should have been the warning. About halfway through the shift, he broke from his route. No call, no report, no explanation. Just a sudden deviation that didn't match anything in the system. By the time we realized it, he was already past the assigned checkpoints, moving toward an area we weren't supposed to cover. We moved to intercept immediately, not just because of protocol, but because we all understood what it meant. When we found him, he wasn't hiding, he wasn't moving, he was standing still, facing the outer section of the base. The same area where visibility drops. The same area where most of us had felt that presence before. But he wasn't scanning. He wasn't reacting. He was waiting. We called out to him. Standard approach. Calm. Controlled. No sudden movement. No response. For a few seconds, he didn't even acknowledge we were there. Then he spoke. Quiet. Flat. They already wrote this part. No one answered. The silence after that felt heavier than anything else that had happened. We started closing the distance slowly, trying to bring him back, to reconnect him to something real. But he didn't move. His focus stayed locked ahead, like he was watching something none of us could see. Then he stepped forward, not toward us, forward, right into the exact section where the reports always placed activity. We stopped him before he could go further, not forcefully, just enough to break the motion. And the moment we did, something changed. He blinked, looked around, confused, like he had just come out of something. The shift was immediate. Whatever had been holding his attention was gone. He didn't remember leaving his route. didn't remember what he said, didn't remember why he was there. But when we got back and checked the system, there was already a report waiting, filed under his name, time-stamped before any of it happened, and right in the middle of it was the exact moment he stepped forward. By the time the last report appeared, no one reacted the way we used to. No confusion, no questions, no attempts to explain it away. We had already moved past that. Still, this one felt different. You could tell before even opening it. It was longer, more structured, like it wasn't just another entry, but something complete. I opened it without saying anything, read through it once, then again, and slower the second time. By the time I looked up, the others were already watching me, waiting. I didn't need to say anything. They could see it. We gathered around the screen, going through it together. The room stayed quiet the entire time, not forced silence, just the absence of anything to say. The report started normally. Time, location, environmental conditions, same format as always. But as it moved forward, something changed. It wasn't describing isolated moments anymore. It was describing sequence, not just what would happen, but how everything connected, movements across different routes, interactions between units, timing that overlapped in ways none of us could have tracked individually. It didn't read like a report anymore. It read like an overview, complete, like something watching everything at once. And the timestamp made it worse. It had been written before any of it happened. We went through it line by line, looking for anything that didn't match, something we could push against, something that would prove it wrong. There wasn't anything. Every detail fit. Every sequence aligned with what we already knew and what we were about to do. There were sections describing actions none of us had taken yet, decisions that hadn't been made, movements that hadn't started. And yet, they didn't feel uncertain. They felt inevitable. That was the moment it changed again. It didn't feel like prediction anymore. It felt like permission, like everything in that report wasn't waiting to happen. It had already been allowed to happen. No one said it out loud, but the idea was there. If everything in that report played out the way it was written, then we weren't being observed anymore. We were following something that had already been set. I went back to the beginning of the report, reading it again, but this time, not as something to understand, as something to follow. And the more I read, the clearer it became. None of it felt optional. Every step felt like it was already in motion, whether we chose it or not. That was the moment everything settled into place. Because if this report was complete, then whatever came next wasn't something we were going to decide. There wasn't a moment where it ended. No final event. No clear stopping point. Things just slowed down. The report stopped appearing. The systems went quiet. The routine stayed the same. On paper, everything returned to normal. But something didn't reset. We still had the reports, every single one of them, logged, time-stamped, archived, like they belonged there. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. The second was what happened when we tried to remember them. It started simple. One of the soldiers pulled up an earlier report, trying to explain it to someone who hadn't been involved. He got halfway through, then stopped. Not because he forgot what he was saying, because he couldn't continue. He remembered finding the report. He remembered reading it. But when he tried to explain what it actually said, the details weren't there anymore. It wasn't like forgetting over time. It was immediate, like the information wasn't accessible anymore. We thought it was just him, fatigue, stress, something temporary. But when we tried it ourselves, the same thing happened. We could read the reports. We could see every detail while looking at them. But the moment we looked away, they faded. Not completely, just enough that we couldn't hold on to them. That was when everything finally clicked. We tried reconstructing the events without the reports, just memory, just what we experienced. And that's where it broke down. We remembered the feeling, the patterns, the missing time, the presence. But when it came to the reports themselves, nothing held, no sequence, no structure, no clear memory of what had been written. And then the realization settled in, slow, quiet, final. It wasn't just that we didn't remember writing the reports. It was that we couldn't remember them at all, not in any way that mattered. I went back to my own entries one last time, read them slowly, carefully, knowing what would happen the moment I looked away. The structure was still there, the tone still precise, the details still complete. But none of it felt like mine anymore, not even close. It felt like something I was allowed to access, not something I created. And as I closed the file, letting the screen go dark, one thought stayed clear while everything else slipped away. It wasn't the reports. It wasn't the missing time. It wasn't even the feeling of being watched. It was something simpler, something worse. If none of us could remember writing any of it, then maybe we never did.